Welcome to the world of sci-fi stories. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe the channel. Enjoy the listening. He wore a Holo-Medallion. The price of that smile was unimaginable. The arrival of the Holo-Medallion, the battlefield was silent. The war had ended here long ago, but the scars of destruction remained. Rusted ships lay broken on the surface of the abandoned colony, their metal skeletons whispering stories of past battles. The air was thick with dust, and the sky above was an endless gray. A small squad of Galactic Alliance soldiers moved carefully through the wreckage. Their boots crunched against the cracked ground as they searched for anything useful. Among them was Captain Duran Reynolds, the only human in the group. He was quiet, focused, his sharp eyes scanning the ruins. Captain called out Sergeant Liren, a tall, scaled alien from the Velar species. "We found something." Reynolds walked over, his heart steady, but his instincts alert. The squad had gathered around a fallen body, half buried under debris. It was wearing human armor. "This one's been here for years," muttered Private Kale, a young soldier with feline features. "Strange, the armor is still intact." Reynolds knelt beside the body. The skeletal remains told him enough. This was no ordinary soldier. The way the armor was reinforced, the markings on the chest plate, this human had been part of something classified. Then he saw it clutched in the court's hand was a small metallic object, a Holo-Medallion. Reynolds felt his breath catch. "Is that a memory device?" Leon asked, reaching for it. "Don't touch it." Reynolds snapped, his voice sharp. The squad looked at him in surprise. He rarely raised his voice. He slowly took the Holo-Medallion from the lifeless fingers. The metal was cold, untouched by time. He pressed a button on the side, and suddenly a faint blue hologram flickered to life. The squad leaned, and the projection showed a group of humans, smiling, laughing, holding each other. Children ran in circles, parents embraced, soldiers stood proudly with medals on their chests. It was a simple, happy scene. Nothing special, but Reynolds stared at it like he had seen a ghost. Liren frowned. "Captain, what's wrong?" Reynolds didn't answer. His fingers trembled slightly as he deactivated the projection and tucked the medallion into his belt. His expression had darkened. Private Cal, confused, spoke up. "It's just a personal memory device, right? Maybe the soldier carried it to remind him of home." Reynolds shook his head. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You don't understand," he said. This isn't just a memory, it's a message." The squad exchanged glances. "Message," Liren repeated. Reynolds stood up, his posture tense. "This medallion is only given to one kind of soldier, the ones who take on missions with no return." Silence fell over the group. Private Kale swallowed hard. "You mean?" He knew he was going to die. Reynolds exhaled. He turned his gaze toward the ruined battlefield, his thoughts racing. "This isn't just a dead soldier," he muttered. "This is a warning." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them shook. A distant explosion echoed across the wasteland. The squad spun around, weapons raised in the far distance. Shadows moved between the wreckage. A presence was there, watching them. Lion's voice was tight. "We're not alone." Reynolds gripped the Holo-Medallion in his fist. He had a feeling that whoever had left this behind had done so for a reason, and now they were too late to turn back. The forgotten morning. The wind howled through the ruins like a mournful ghost. Captain Reynolds and his squad crouched behind the wreckage of an old dropship, their weapons raised, eyes scanning the shadows. The explosion had come from the far side of the ruins, but the real danger wasn't the blast, it was the silence that followed. Something was out there, watching, waiting. Sergeant Lion tightened his grip on his rifle. "Captain, orders." Reynolds didn't answer. Immediately his fingers traced the edges of the Holo-Medallion in his pocket, the weight of it heavy against his palm. It wasn't just an old relic, it was a warning left by a soldier who never came home. "We move," Reynolds said at last, his voice low. "Stay close, keep quiet." The squad advanced through the wreckage, their footsteps muffled by the dust-covered ground. They passed broken mechs, shattered helmets, and half-buried weapons that hadn't been fired in decades. The battle here had been brutal, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just war that had destroyed this place. There was something else. As they moved, Private Kale whispered, "Sir, what exactly is that medallion? You said it's a warning, but a warning about what?" Reynolds kept walking, his jaw clenched. "There's an old saying among soldiers, so others may live. It's a promise, a sacrifice." He held up the medallion, letting the squad see the etched words on the back. "Do not fool, leave this place." The squad exchanged nervous glances. Lion muttered, "Great, and we're doing the exact opposite." A metallic clang echoed. "Eat." Through the ruins, the squad froze. Reynolds raised a fist, signaling them to hold position. His heartbeat was steady, but his instincts screamed danger. Then something moved in the distance. A figure, tall, humanoid but wrong, stepped into view. Its body was dread in ragged, mismatched armor, and its eyes glowed dimly like embers in the dark. It wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the wreckage, some laying, others standing unnaturally still. Their armor was human, or at least it had been once, but their bodies, Lion whispered in horror, "They're not alive." The warriors who had fallen here had never left. Reynolds tightened his grip on his weapon. "They're not just bodies." The figures began to move fast. "Contact!" Lion shouted. The first one lunged, its movements a blur. Reynolds fired 3 rounds to the chest, 1 to the head. The thing staggered, but didn't fall back. "Fall back," Reynolds ordered. The squad scrambled as the creatures charged. Kale fired wildly, his bullets sparking against ancient armor. One of the things grabbed him, its fingers like steel clamps, and he screamed. Reynolds spun, his knife flashing, 1 swift cut to the neck. The creature's head lolled to the side, but still it didn't fall. "They die." Kala gasped, struggling free. Lion pulled out a plasma grenade. "Let's see if they burn." He hurled it. The blast ripped through the closest attackers, sending dust and shattered metal flying. The creatures stopped, then slowly they turned their heads toward the squad and smiled. Reynolds' blood ran cold. Those weren't human smiles. They were wrong, too wide, too unnatural. Leon's voice trembled. "Sir, what the hell are we fighting?" Reynolds looked at the Holo-Medallion in his palm. The soldier who had left it had known this would happen, and now it was too late to turn back. The smiling ones. The squad ran. Footsteps pounded against the cracked earth as Reynolds led his team through the ruins, weaving between collapsed structures and shattered vehicles. The things behind them didn't chase in a straight line. They moved through the wreckage like they knew every inch of it, like they had lived here before or died here. Private Kale gasped between breaths. "Captain, what are those things?" Reynolds didn't answer. His mind was racing. They weren't alive, but they weren't dead either. His fingers clenched around the whole medallion. There had to be an answer ahead. A half-buried bunker entrance came into view. The door was broken open, rusted with time there. Inside, Reynolds ordered the squad dove through the entrance, their boots kicking up dust. Reynolds spun, yanking a blast charge from his belt and slamming it against the doorframe. Fire in the hole. The charge detonated. The wall shook, and the entrance collapsed, sealing them inside. Darkness swallowed them. For a long moment, the only sound was their own breathing. Then Cal's voice came shaky. "Sir." They were smiling. Reynolds exhaled, glancing down at the whole medallion in his palm. The words were still their doom. "Note full, leave this place." He had ignored the warning. Now they were trapped. Sergeant Leon activated his shoulder, like the beam cutting through the dust-filled air. The bunker stretched deep underground hallways, disappearing into shadows. Reynolds looked at his team. "They needed answers. Move," he said, leading them deeper. Inside, buried truths. The bunker smelled old dust, rust, and something else. Something rotten. The walls were lined with consoles frozen mid-operation. Some screens still flickered their messages, distorted. Pro-EC. Protocol. Stews. Classified last ENT 108 years ago. Lyran studied the screen. "This place. It's a research facility." Kale pointed to a row of lockers, each labeled with names, human names. "This was a military outpost." He muttered, "But where's the crew?" Reynolds already knew. They never left. His voice was grim as he motioned toward a metal door at the end of the hall. The symbol above it sent chills through his spine. A whole medallion just like the one in his pocket the same morning. The team exchanged glances. No one wanted to be the first to enter. Reynolds sighed. They had no choice. He pushed the door open. The first recording. Inside the room was lined with stasis pods, but they weren't intact. Some were shattered, others were open, empty. The walls were covered in deep claw marks. Leon cursed under his breath. Something got out. Cale swallowed hard, or something woke up at the center of the room. A console blinked, demanding attention. Reynolds stepped forward and pressed P. A hologram flickered to life. A man in a torn officer's uniform appeared, ghostly, desperate. His face was hollow, his eyes dark with fear. To anyone who finds this, we made a mistake. The team froze. The hologram continued, his voice shaking. Project EO was meant to preserve fallen soldiers, to bring them back, but they weren't the same. Something else came with them. Cale backed away from the screen. No. The recording glitched, then returned. They smile. They always smile, but they are not human anymore. Lion's breath hitched. If you see them, the hologram officer looked directly at the camera, his face deadly serious. Do not let them touch you. Do not listen to them. And whatever you do, never smile back. The message ended. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a soft noise came from behind them, a whisper, a chuckle. Smiling Lion's light flickered, and in the reflection of the console screen, they weren't alone anymore. The smiling ones are watching. Silence. Reynolds could hear his own heartbeat. It pounded in his ears like a worm. His team stood frozen, their bodies rigid, their breaths shallow. The reflection on the console screen was impossible to ignore. They were not alone. In the dim light, barely visible behind them, a figure stood tall, motionless, smiling. The grin was too wide, too unnatural. Teeth gleaming in the darkness. Lance's hand trembled on his rifle. Sir, his voice barely a whisper. Don't move, Reynolds commanded. His mind raced. The holo recording's warning echoed in his head. Do not let them touch you. Do not listen to them. And whatever you do, never smile back. Callie whimpered. Captain, what do we do? Reynolds didn't answer. He reached for his Holo-Medallion, gripping it like a lifeline. The figure tilted its head. The motion was jerky, like something trying to mimic human movement, but failing. Then another whisper, soft, playful. You found our home. The voice was wrong. It didn't echo like a normal sound. It sank into their bones. The figure took a step forward. Reynolds snapped into action. Go now. Running in the dark, the team bolted down the corridor. The bunker was a maze of steel and concrete, but Reynolds didn't care where they ran as long as it was away behind them. The smiling figure didn't chase it. Walked slow, steady, unhurried. And then more footsteps. Not one, not two, a dozen. Cale turned his face pale. Captain, there's more of them. The shadows twisted. More figures emerged from the darkness, stepping into the flickering emergency lights, smiling. Always smiling. Some were missing pieces. A soldier with half a face, a medic with arms twisted the wrong way, a scientist with sunken eyes that never blinked, all of them grinning. Lyran yanked Reynolds by the arm. We can't outrun them. We need to find another way out. Reynolds scanned the hall, then spotted a security hatch up ahead. There, he slammed the controls, and the door slid open. The squad poured inside, and Reynolds hit the override, slamming it shut just as the first figure reached the doorway. A hand pressed against the glass, a human hand, or at least it used to be. Slowly, deliberately, it waved, and then it spoke. We remember you. Reynolds felt his breath stop, because on its wrist he saw a Holo-Medallion, and the name etched into the metal was his own, locked in with the truth. The team stumbled back. Cal's hands were shaking. Sir, what does that mean? Reynolds didn't know, didn't want to know. Leon scanned the room. Sir, this isn't just a bunker. The walls were lined with storage pods. Some were open, their contents long gone. Others were still occupied. Inside, the glass figures floated, not alive, not dead. Some looked like his team, some looked like him. Cal staggered back. No, what is this? Reynolds grabbed him. Keep it together, soldier, but his own hands were shaking. Now the console beside them flickered to life. A new holo recording played. This time the voice was his own. If you're hearing this, it means you don't remember. You came back. We always come back. And soon you'll smile too. The recording ended. The team stood in horror. Then the door behind them slid open, and the smiling ones stepped inside. The ones who came before. The air inside the bunker felt thick, heavy, as if reality itself was suffocating. Reynolds clenched his fists. His team stood frozen, their backs against the storage pods. The figures at the doorway, they were waiting, smiling, always smiling. They did not rush forward. They did not attack. They simply watched. Leon whispered, "What do they want?" No one answered. Then slowly one of them stepped forward, a woman, or something that used to be one. Her face was eerily familiar, too familiar because Reynolds recognized her. Dark Marlowe. She had been one of the first scientists assigned to this expedition. She had vanished years ago. Her Holo-Medallion was still clutched in her fingers. Her voice was soft, almost human. "You stayed too long." The unseen cost. Reynolds couldn't move. His breath came in short gs, his body locked in place. Kayla was shaking. "Captain, I think I remember her." Reynolds looked at him sharply. "What?" Cale clutched his head. I don't know how, but I remember her face. "I remember this place." His voice cracked. "I think I've been here before." Reynolds' stomach twisted. Impaled. "That's not possible. None of us have." A low, unnatural chuckle interrupted them. Mara took another step forward. Her movements were stiff, as if her body wasn't fully hers anymore, like a puppet on invisible strings. "No one ever leaves," she said. Cale let out a strangled gasp, gripping his medallion. "That's what the voice in my head keeps saying." Reynolds grabbed him. "Stay with me, soldiers, stay with me." Cale's eyes were wide, terrified. "But Captain, what if we already left?" The words hit Reynolds like a shockwave. What if they weren't the first version of themselves to come here? What if they had already died? What if they had already smiled? The forgotten echoes. "Lee," Lauren cursed, "we need to get out of here now." Reynolds wasn't sure if there even was an out, but he wasn't about to give up. The bunker's control panel was still active. He sprinted toward it, fingers flying over the keys. If this place had logs, records, then he needed to see them. And what he found made his blood run cold. Mission entry log. Team 17. Status: Sia Seed. Mission entry log. Team 18. Status: Sia Seed. Mission entry log. Team 19. Status: unknown. Reynolds' own name was there. His team's names were there. Cale, Liren, the others. Again and again and again, teams with their names had come here before and never left. He turned to his squad. His voice was quiet, unsteady. "We're not the first." Cale stepped forward, trembling. "Captain, if we're Team 19, he swallowed hard. "What happened to Team 18? The console beeped. A new Holo recording appeared. The screen flickered, and Reynolds' own face stared back at him. The final warning. The recording played. His own voice came through the speakers. "To whoever sees this, I don't have long." The recorded Reynolds was wounded, breathing heavily. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. "We tried to leave. We failed." Behind him, the shadows moved. Figures, smiling figures, were closing in. "If you're hearing this, then you're just another version of us." His recorded self exhaled. "And that means you have a choice: run or smile." The screen flickered to black silence. Reynolds turned. Slowly, the figures in the doorway were closer now. Kel's breathing grew ragged. His medallion began to glow, and then Mara smiled wider. "Choose the choice that wasn't ours." The bunker lights flickered. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the cold metal walls. Reynolds' mind raced. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. And yet the figures stood motionless, their smiles unchanged. Kel's hands trembled over his whole medallion. "Choose." The voice came from all around them. Mara's lips moved, but it wasn't just her speaking. It was the bunker itself. Lion's fingers tightened around her rifle. "Captain," she whispered. "I think." Cale suddenly screamed. A memory that never was. Reynolds lunged, grabbing Cale before he collapsed. Kel's eyes rolled back, his body convulsing. His medallion pulsed with a sickly glow, as if something inside it was trying to escape. Then he stopped moving. Silence. Kel's eyes slowly opened. That something was wrong. He smiled, not a normal smile, not his smile, a perfect empty one. Reynolds' stomach dropped. Cal's voice came out, distorted, echoing. We never left Cal. Captain Reynolds felt something cold grip his spine. Cale stood up too smoothly, too wrong, and the others began to smile too, the smiling ones. Lurin took a step back. What the hell is happening? Reynolds grabbed his rifle, but deep down he knew Cale, the real Cale, was gone, or worse, he was still there, watching from behind his own eyes. Cal's head tilted too far, his voice was almost gentle. You should smile too, Captain. Reynolds aimed his gun. Cale didn't flinch. The figures behind him moved, not walking, gliding, effortless. Wrong. The bunker doors sealed shut. There was no escape. The unspoken truth, the whisper, crawled through Reynolds' mind. We never left. We never left. We never left. The Holo-Medallions. They weren't just recording history, they were keeping it. Every version of them, every attempt to leave, locked in time. The more they tried to escape, the more copies were made. The smiling figures weren't others, they were them, and Cale was already gone. Leon's voice shook. Captain, what do we do? Reynolds' grip tightened on his weapon. The smiling one took another step forward. Their hollow eyes never blinked. And they all had Holo-Medallions, glowing just like his. He finally understood they had never been choosing. The choice had already been made. The last reflection. The room was silent, not the kind of silence that comes with peace, the kind that watches, the kind that waits. Reynolds' heartbeat hammered against his ribs. Cale stood there, smiling, his Holo-Medallion glowing softly. Lion gripped her weapon, but she didn't fire. Could she really shoot a friend, even if he wasn't him anymore? Captain, Cale said, you can still join us. Reynolds' grip on his rifle tightened. His mouth was dry. Join you? Cale's smile widened. It's already happened. The truth behind the medallions, the Holo-Medallions, weren't just memories, they were doors. And every time a soldier died wearing one, they weren't simply remembered, they were copied. Cale wasn't the first. He wasn't even the real Cale anymore. He was one of them. Reynolds' breath caught in his throat. He looked at the walls, at the faint outlines of faces shifting in the metal, as if the bunker itself was watching them. Then he realized it wasn't the bunker, it was their reflection. Hundreds of them, hundreds of smiling versions of themselves, standing in the dark, waiting the choice that was never theirs. Reynolds turned to Lion. She was staring at her own Holo-Medallion, hands shaking. She looked up at him. If we die, Captain, we stay. Reynolds nodded slowly. He had known this truth the moment he saw Cale's smile. No one ever really left. And the ones who thought they did, they were just watching themselves from the other side. The figures took a step forward. Reynolds exhaled. No. He ripped the Holo-Medallion from his chest and threw it to the ground. Lion followed, crushing hers beneath her boot. The light flickered. Cal's face twisted for the first time. The other reflections shuddered. The medallions were the link, and breaking them meant breaking the cycle. The bunker screamed. The smiling figures lunged, but they weren't solid anymore. The room rippled. Reality fractured. And then epilogue. The price of remembering. Reynolds and Lion awoke on the cold metal floor. The bunker was empty. No Cale, no figures, no whispers. Their medallions were gone. Reynolds sat up, head pounding. Had it worked? Had they escaped? Lion turned to him, pale as a ghost. She raised a shaking hand. Reynolds followed her gaze to the reflective steel wall, and there in the glass-like surface, Cale still stood, still smiling, still watching.